Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Solar Embrace, Chapter 5, Kiss of the River. The pair had managed to travel through the jungle for another hour before a new obstacle presented itself. Spike and Celestia knew from the waterfall off in the distance that there would be rapids along some stretch of the river, but they had not expected to be so close to the thorn wall. To say it was a small river might have been an understatement. It was not terribly wide, maybe no more than 40 feet across, but the water rushing through it looked strong enough to crush anything that entered into its fold. The turbulent water that lay before them was somewhat colored like chocolate, with the occasional boulder sticking out along the waterway. Moss grew on the boulders, and smaller rocks lining the banks, and nearly every tree along the banks had dead branches, so long that the sparse canopy overhead was like a woven basket. Foam frothed in the small whirlpools and eddies that lay behind every large boulder, with more resting in the much calmer waters of a few sheltered banks. In short, it wasn't a good river to try and cross, especially with the rains from each day before having given it an extra surge it might. "Well, how do we cross?" Spike asked, walking up and down the surprisingly brush-clear bank. A good 5-foot wide swath followed the stretch of the river, clear of all the brush, like some pony had come through with a giant brush clutter. "We can't swim, obviously. Indeed, and we cannot hope to jump from rock to rock," Celestia said as she walked with Spike. "They are far too slippery. The water has worn them down to the smoothest, resembling the tile floor." "What about climbing through the branches?" Spike asked, glancing up at the dead branches like they were a thorn wall all over again. Some of the bigger ones looked sturdy. One such branch snapped off at the base the minute a butterfly landed on its uppermost to outermost tip, sending the wooden debris tumbling over into the raging waters below. The butterfly flew off in a perceivably panic, while Celestia simply shook her head. "None of them will support our weight," she said, watching as a branch was broken apart on the rocks. Little slivers and pieces of it floated down the stream like tiny boats, only to be swallowed up by a whirlpool behind 3 large boulders. And even if they could, it would be very dangerous for both of them. If either of us fell into the water, I doubt the other would be able to reach them in time. "Yeah," Spike muttered as he strolled along the bank, looking for any way to get across the jungle. Eventually gave way to the grass hills, and then the old lava flows. And from there, they still had to scale the mountain, or whatever Celestia had hidden, whatever it was she had. But the real trouble was that the here and now, not the possibilities of the future part of the journey. Walking up and leaning against a dead-looking tree, Spike gently tapped his tail against the base as the further descended into thought. Celestia, wrapped in her own musings, leaned on the same tree right alongside him. Her own thoughts mirrored his own. A nice change of pace from the confusing and oddly comforting thoughts about each other. Celestia, as it so happened, glanced up at a tree that they were leaning against, a possible idea forming in her head. Could they build a boat from the trunk of the tree? Not likely. None of these trunks are thick enough for a makeshift canoe, and we don't have any strong vines to equivalent rope-like material to lash a raft together, she thought to herself, absent-mindedly running her hand over the trunk. It was sturdy, yes, but they could not hope to simply build a bridge with it. They would need a whole bunch of ropes to hold the beams together, and... "Ah!" Celestia said, her cry of victory startling Spike out of his thoughts. In fact, it startled him so much he slipped off the tree trunk to his side and landed flat on his ass. "Oh, sorry, Spike." "Ugh, I'm fine, the dragon mumbled, rising to his feet as he rubbed his sore buttocks. Those big rocks he had landed on had quite possibly the worst texture to feel on one's ass, jagged but flat, so everything ballooned around the piece. So you got any idea? I suppose. So you got an idea, I suppose. Yes, I have an idea, Celestia said, suppressing an urge to giggle. Finally, it was her turn to contribute. For the last day, she had done nothing but get in the way, or get hurt, or be a burden, but not this time. Can you cut this tree down with your talons? She patted the tree she was leaning against with her good measure, in case he didn't know. Yeah, sure, I guess, Spike said, walking up to it. Which way do you want it to fall? I'm no lumber pony I've never cut down trees before, but I think I can get it to fall a certain way. No promises, though. See if you can cut it so it will fall across the river, the princess said, pointing to the other side we need to cross, and I do not see any nearby bridges, so we will have to make our own makeshift one. Wow. And here I was thinking of building a dam to block the stream for a few short moments, the dragon muttered with a slightly sheepish grin. Yes, thinking like a beaver isn't all it's cracked up to be. Why would... what? Thinking like a beaver not have benefits? Celestia asked. I mean, they are hard-working creatures. They work well in a family groups, care for one another, and... I'm just saying, it's just a saying of Fluttershy's, Spike said. It's along the lines of, yeah, but in this case, I think I took it a bit too literally. And the princess chuckled slightly at that, walking away from the tree as she did so. Well, best get going, Spike. I'm sorry I can't magically make a 2-pony hacksaw for us or anything, but at least I'd be able to help. Hey, you're the princess. I should be honored to be able to assist you in anything you desire, Spike said with a mock-serious bow before he got to work, his talons flashing. He began to carve through the old trunk as close to the base as he could, making sure to keep the cuts facing the river. Anything I desire, Celestia asked, an unfamiliar, blooming sensation flittering through her brain. It felt like a combination of euphoria and the feeling of satisfaction some pony would feel after accomplishing a hard day's work. What do you think I would desire, Spike? Spike almost flinched at this, the question getting a bit too close to his thoughts of her while he was trailblazing just a short time ago. Celestia, I'm not sure this is the right kind of question to ask me. I don't really know you all that much. Nonsense, Spike. It is perfectly reasonable for me to ask you such a question, Celestia said, the same blooming feeling coursing through her veins. Perhaps those berries she had eaten acted as a stimulant. It still stands, you know. What do you think I desire? Well, Spike began, almost missing the trunk with a few swings of his talon. Peace, I guess. Maybe freedom? Peace I can understand, though quite a few years ago, in the eyes of you and your friends, the invasion of Canterlot by Chrysalis and her hordes did show my subjects we are not immune to the goings-on in the world around us, the princess said gently, seating herself on a peculiarly square-shaped rock. An easy enough assumption, and a correct one as well, I might add. But I'm curious. Why did you say freedom? I'm not really sure, the dragon said slowly, trying to focus his body on the task at hand, while still freeing up enough of his brain to process what Celestia was saying. If he didn't, he'd likely miss a couple swings and look like an idiot swinging away at nothing. Did you perhaps mean freedom for my ponies? Celestia asked, her voice sounding a tad off even to herself. Maybe those leaves acted as an emotional enhancer. Am I not a good princess? Do I not serve my subjects with the grace, dignity, and care they deserve? No, yes. Ugh. Spike shouted, stopping for a second to bury his face into his hands. "You're a great ruler, Celestia," he mumbled through his fingers before uncovering his face and getting back to work. "Greater than you think," he added softly. "In what way?" Celestia asked, her voice not demanding tone, but pretty close to it. She wanted to know, and although it was unlike her to think like this, she would pester him until he told her. "Tell me. I can take criticism. It comes with the duty I have taken upon myself as co-ruler of Equestria." "You're nothing like the other royalty I've heard about around the world," the dragon said softly as he stopped to measure his way through the tree. "Almost a full third of the way, though. Through, but with a trunk this strong, there was no telling how much more he'd have to go through to make it fall. You're kind, compassionate, and gentle, with a good conscience, and a drive to see the ponies you rule live good and happy lives. Your agendas, if you even have any, are always for good of your subjects, and you've repeatedly shown you're highly willing to delegate power if it means happiness for us all." Celestia was silent for a moment, as if taken aback by shock. Spike's words were honest, but she had had no idea he had felt that way, or even that many of her subjects felt that way. If his answer was anything to go by, she had just thought she was well liked because she was a kind ruler. The strange feeling in her body continued surging as his praises hit home for her. "Well, Spike, that is a very gallant thing to say, and I must say I am honored to be held in such high esteem. But getting back to my earlier question, why do you think I am a pony? All ponies desire freedom." I think it has to do with your title," Spike mumbled as he made another splash into the tree. "You're a princess, one of the two most powerful figures in Equestria, and indeed the world. You raise and lower the sun at will, with or without any pony asking you to do so. You're always on the same with it all as well. Never late, never early, always on time. You speak with countless dignitaries on the behalf of Equestria citizens. You foster treaties that are more than fair to both parties, and you constantly lend power to those most suited for using it wisely." He sighed. "Maybe I'm just crazy, but you need a break from all that. At least I think you need to." "A break?" Celestia asked, arching her eyebrows as the river continued to rush past them. "A break from my duties. This excursion of ours is to save the world, and it is likely the first time I have had so little to actually do that involved something other than my daily duties. Why would I need a break?" "Like I said, I'm not sure, but," Spike began, his voice lowering slightly, "you do so much, all the time, with so little to show for it. You're a beloved princess of the sun, the shining beacon in our daily lives. But what time do you have to yourself? What sacrifices have you made over the countless years to make our lives better? At the cost of your own satisfaction and happiness? You are by far the least likely pony to be jealous. But don't you ever wonder what it's like to be free of those duties and those burdens for even a day?" Celestia paused for a few moments, letting his words sink in. "I have given them some thought, Spike. Many, many times, in fact. It's just..." She let her words hang in the air, her voice trailing off. "Just what?" Spike asked, as the tree swayed slightly in the light breeze, more so than it normally would have. Spike was getting closer. In fact, he was now halfway through. "It's just, Spike, I'm co-ruler of Equestria. Other than some very important diplomatic visit, or some world-saving mission like now, I can't just take the day off. I have far too many responsibilities and duties to take care of on a daily business. And I have gotten used to such a life. In my many, many centuries of life, I have learned to be very proficient at managing my time wisely." She smiled slightly at that. Sure, the statement was a bit prideful, but it was true. "But still, haven't you ever wanted something a bit less, I don't know, monotonous?" Spike asked as he stopped swiping at the tree, and went around to the backside. It must get bothering to do that all day in, day out. Occasionally, the overall feeling of accomplishment does not eclipse the stress of the day, but it is a burden I must bear, the princess said softly as she watched the dragon push against the tree with his shoulder. May I ask what you're doing? This, Spike said with a grunt. Pushed with all his might, a noise emanated from the base as the trunk and squeak, then a groan, and then finally a rather long-lasting tearing sound as the old plant tissue inside the tree gave way. The tree fell slowly at first, but as with all things that fall, it rapidly gained speed until it crashed through the undergrowth in its way. With a mighty crash, one so great it made Celestia bounce off her seat and onto the ground, the tree slammed into the ground. Some of the lower branches snapped off from the sheer forces exerted from upon the tree's stop, plunging into the river with mighty splashes. Spike, who had been knocked back by the jolt, slowly stood back up. He shook his head and peered through the falling leaves and upper branches, the area now somewhat brighter with the removal of the sun-blocking canopy. Granted, there had been almost no leaves on the tree, but the sunlight flittering through the freshly made gap was a pleasant thing to see. Did it make it to the other side? Celestia asked, gently rubbing her bottom as she rose to her hooves. There was a small tear along her lower back of her gown, from where she had grazed her seat, making an already beaten material even more flimsy. A few more inopportune slices here and there, and the whole thing would just fall apart. Spike stepped onto the trunk, and balanced himself while he peered at the other side of the river. The larger top of the branches were caught with the lower ones on the opposite bank's trees, and a few had managed to worm their way into the ground as well. From here, all the plants along the bank had completely flattened under the tree's mighty weight. Yep, he said, taking a few steps forward before looking back at the Sun Princess. She hadn't moved. Well, we don't have all day, you know. Spike couldn't resist the urge to grin, as he had just made a bridge out of a tree in less time than he had thought it would take. Talk about progress. By the time they needed to bed down for the night, they hopefully would be able to be all the way to the grassy hill. Of course, Celestia said in a hurried manner, hiking up her dress and slightly to give her legs a bit more room to maneuver. In a few leaps and bounds she was at the trunk, and, with the helping hands from Spike, found herself astride of the fallen piece of timber. Okay, now all we need to do is get across, Spike said, slowly walking forward. However, a hand upon his shoulder stopped him dead in his tracks. Spike, I'm not sure of this, Celestia said, looking past Spike and into the turbulent waters. The way it frothed and splashed looked far more dangerous from above than it had from alongside it. Come on, Princess, it won't be that hard. Celestia, he added, noting the slightly exasperated expression that flickered across her features. He really needed to remember to call her by her name. It's only about 40 feet or so, and the trunk is nice and wide for us to walk on. Yes, but I'm not sure my balance will hold up as well as yours, she replied, forcing herself to look away from the water and into Spike's eyes. Your feet are far more suited for gripping than my hooves. All it will take is one little slip and then hold on to my tail for balance, Spike said, swinging his large appendage out for the princess to grab onto. If you fall, I'll catch you. Just like the thorn wall, remember? Celestia looked at the large, scaly thing in front of her, her usual decisiveness giving way to the self-doubt. Would she be able to balance well enough where she wouldn't stumble and possibly push Spike off? Her hooves would not grip anything, and she had never before needed to balance herself on something like this tree trunk. Plus, How would she hold onto his tail? Put her hands under the groove and the spades near the base, or perhaps onto the spines along his back. Spike looked from Celestia to the other side of the river and back. "We'll take it slow, Celestia," he said. "Come on. My tail won't bite." Celestia incited her courage and to make her do what needed to be done. And with a firm resolve, she gripped Spike by the tail, right below where his spade fanned out from the main stem. Feeling the muscles flex underneath the scales, she quietly nodded in his direction. "Go on, Spike, lead the way." Spike nodded, and looked to where his feet would go, taking a gentle step forward. So far, so good, he thought slowly, walking across the log. He could feel Celestia's soft hands digging into his scales, but she was doing great so far. Another step, and then another, and repeating pattern that now would take them all the way across the log. "Spike, I know now is not the best time, but do you think something was in those berries?" Celestia asked, making sure to firmly plant each step with her hooves as not to slip. The tree trunks wasn't slippery, but it was round, and round objects are easy to fall off of. "What?" Spike asked, almost stopping to turn around to look at her in confusion. "Are you feeling sick or something?" "Well, not sick," Celestia said slowly as she slightly stepped over the remains of an old branch. "I feel rather odd is all." That was true enough, as she felt a heat come to her cheeks without any input from her. It was like her body was reacting to those berries, but just what was this reaction? "Well, you did say those leaves and berries were edible, since it was you that brought them on the island," Spike said as a small bird flittered over his head. "Do you remember the exact species of plants they are? It wouldn't do well for us to have just eaten some leaves that act as powerful laxatives or anything." No, the leaves are fine," Celestia said, shaking her head very slightly, as to not upset her center of gravity. "No, the berries, though. I remember they were used in a special herbal remedy in many backwater communities, but for the everlong life of me I cannot remember exactly what they do." Spike gingerly stepped over another dead branch. "Well, let's go through our options," he said, as he felt Celestia take another step after him. "Whatever you're feeling, it's not affecting me in the slightest, and you weighed a bit more than I did, so that could be the reason why you're feeling, and I'm not. Other than that, you are just feeling a bit odd?" "Yes," the princess said, as she gingerly stepped over the same dead lower branch Spike had. "Like my body is pushing me towards a feeling I cannot describe. I feel compelled to do something, though I know not what that something is." "Are the berries making you sleepy?" Spike asked. It could be like those sleeping berries Zecora used to help parents put restless foals to bed. No, I'm wide awake," Celestia said as her eyes trailed down his back and onto a portion of his tail where her hands were currently gripping, looking where it caused her to slightly shift her focus to the raging waters below once more. So she shut her eyes tightly for a second, reopening them when she was sure she wasn't going to be looking at the water again. It worked. Her eyes were now fixed on the back of Spike's head. "Well, are you seeing things that aren't there?" Spike asked as he slowly took another step. They were almost halfway there. "Hallucinogenic ones are like the kind Pinky accidentally put in Twilight's birthday cake last year." Wow, that had been hilarious indeed. Spike had come home to find Twilight trying to eat a book, which she at the time claimed to be a giant dandelion sandwich. That poor book still had the teeth marks in it, and to this day Twilight refused to believe any pony who said it looked like some pony had chewed on it. Never mind what the others had been doing upon his return. Pinky had been practicing kung fu on her shadow with the marginal success. Fluttershy was somehow hovering without flapping her wings. Rainbow Dash and Applejack had been locked in a wrestling match with an old blanket, and Rarity, oh poor Opal, the poor cat would never forget her owner for dyeing her cat's entire body lime green, and all the while spouting, "How fabulous you look, Mr. Cockadill Pickle." No, I'm not seeing anything unusual, though it is becoming rather focused, Celestia said as she continued to tip-hoofed behind Spike. I feel anxious, even more now than before, and I can't seem to just say what it is. It's like one of those feelings you can't describe, you know? All too well, Celestia, the dragon said as he lowered his foot on the trunk again. There was a loud cracking sound as Spike's foot shot clear through the trunk, and the tree as he stepped down, the rotten splinters flying everywhere. This tumble sent Celestia forward, flying over his tail and landing right on his back. "Spike," she cried, as another loud crack was heard, her hands curling around his neck in surprise and fright. From where Spike was crunched through, the crack spread along the outside of the trunk, like a winding snake, the rupture quickly encircling the trunk. "Hold on," Spike shouted, as another groan, like the one from the tree fell over, as emanated from where they were stuck. "Wah, wah," was all Celestia could say before the tree snapped in half, both middle ends falling away from the alicorn dragon. For an instant the pair of them were suspended in mid-air, and Celestia, again her will, beat her wings to keep them that way. Sadly, her wings were still hurt, and she clutched them to her sides as they fell, a sharp pain shooting through where they connected on her back. "Son of a... son of a..." Spike managed to say before they plunged into the water, the surprisingly colder liquid, pushing them the instant they were submerged. Tumbling under somewhat murky surface, Spike managed to push up from the bottom with his tail, propelling Celestia and himself out of the water's surface. As their faces rose above the water, the now panicked duo breathed huge gulps of air. Spike, the first to have his eyes clear, twisted Celestia around so she was behind him, and they flew downstream with the current. Celestia was able to see what he did that split second before the impact. "Oof!" They both cried as Spike slammed into a large boulder, the impact sending a few small chips of the rock flying away from where his talons met stone. He lashed out and tried to grip the hard material, but no avail. His claws skidded and slipped along the surface. Again they were underway, at the mercy of the river's power, bobbing like a pair of conjoined corks. The duo gasped for air, as every breath was a luxury they could ill afford to miss. Spike's tail helped balance them as they went along, but the large appendage did little to slow them down. No matter how much he tried to dig into the river's bottom, Spike spun Celestia away from another boulder as they rammed into it, the hard surface once again proving far too slippery for Spike's talons to take hold onto. Spike, spluttering and wheezing from the bone-jarring impacts of the next two boulders, flung his arms up in frustration as Celestia shivered on his back, chilly water seeming to seep into her very bones. As luck would have it, Spike managed to fling his arms to an opportune moment. The river, it seemed had claimed far more trees in its time than previously thought, and so when he did, his hand snagged a tree laying over the river, the lower branches hovering mere inches above the water. Spike's grip proved strong enough this time, as he managed to clamp onto the branches and hold them in place. All around them, the water churned and frothed as it rushed by them, but little bubbles forming in small wakes swirling behind their bodies. "How did we not see this tree?" Celestia gasped, finally managing to hold her head above the water for a mere more than a few seconds. Her mane tailed behind her, absolutely soaked once more. Her crown was askew. The reason it was on was due to the fact she had placed a spell on it a few days ago, so that only a living being, sentient of course, could physically remove it from her head. "We're a good distance away from where We started, Spike gasped in return, his body aching from the number of times he had slammed into large, slippery boulders. We went around that last bend, and we wouldn't have seen it. Anyway, the undergrowth here is too thick. Okay, we're in a better position now, the princess said, her wings feeling like they had absorbed a good 50 gallons of water. Can you move towards shore? Yeah, I think I can. Spike wheezed, his breath returning. Slowly, he moved his hand to another branch. His arms swung out like those of a monkey, swinging with the current. His hand latched on to the next branch, and then another. Their progress was slow and rather bone-chilling, but they were getting closer and closer to the opposite shore. Celestia heard a large splash and a crashing noise behind them, and so, naturally, they looked to see the source of the commotion was. Her eyes grew as large as saucers as she saw what was barreling towards them. "Spike, you may want to go faster," she cried out. Spike turned as he swung to the next branch, his eyes turned as comically large as Celestia's had. The two halves of the tree had broken through and were barreling down the river like two massive crocodiles, the halves slamming into boulders and bouncing off with seemingly minor damage at all. From the speed from which they were moving, to be hit by one, if not both, would be deadly. Spike grunted as he wheeled his body to go faster, swinging from branch to branch as fast as he could without letting himself be pulled fully into the water's embrace. Celestia spurred him on with the words like, "Faster, and you can do this," and the like. The water churned around them as the branch Spike let go of occasionally snapped off behind them. The river's temperature remained cold, but still he pressed on, his lungs burning as he struggled to breathe. Finally, Spike was on the last branch, and that was good news. Bad news was that the next nearest hold was a jiggly, jagged boulder, with lay a good 6 feet away. The worst news was the two halves of the tree were almost upon them, and if they hit the tree they were on, they might be crushed by it when it fell. "Hold on," Spike shouted, using his tail to springboard while pulling with all his might. He launched the pair of them at the rock, their bodies almost entirely leaving the water as he did so. The instant they were halfway there, two pieces of an old tree trunk smashed into the overhanging tree, snapping it in half as the resulting collision sprayed chips of wood and old branches everywhere. The water churned even more so, frothing and bubbling as the two remains of the tree seemingly did battle amidst the current. Spike's talons managed to find a hold on the boulder as soon as they landed, but in the instant he tried to pull them up and out of the water, a large chunk of wood slammed into the side of his head. Crying out in pain, he let one hand go on instinct to clutch his hurt face. Suddenly, the weight of both of them on the remaining hand nearly made him lose his grip entirely. Had it not been for the quick thinking of Celestia, as Spike clutched his face with one hand, Celestia's own hands lashed out and gripped the rock with all her might, the weight of somewhat being lifted from Spike's own grip. "Come on, we're almost there," she said to Spike, as the trees behind them eventually swept past, the destroyed branches bumping into them as they floated away in the current. "You can do this, Spike." Grunting, and as his face massaging hand went back to the boulder, Spike pulled the both of them up and out, Celestia's own hands moving with his own small handholds. The rock's somewhat jagged surface scraped futilely against the dragon's scales, a few of the longer shards breaking off against the much harder surface. Spike's shirt, soaking wet, was ripped to shreds by the rock and tattered, falling off and washing away downstream. His pants were shredded as he managed to drag them completely out of the water, his arms aching as they both tumbled over the rock and onto the soft grassy ground on the other side. Celestia coughed and spluttered slightly from the impact, her body feeling like a block of lukewarm ice. Her wings weighed her down. Her dress was soaked once more. There were tears across the clothing's back that had not been there before, and her hooves felt like they had been split on the sharp rocks. But she was alive, and so was Spike. After a few minutes of rest, the pair of them sat up, Spike leaning against the rock for support as he gently rubbed the side of his face where the tree had caught him. Managing to get on all fours, Without collapsing from exhaustion, Celestia crawled over to Spike and kneeled next to him, her hand quickly removing some of the mane from her face. "Spike, are you okay?" she asked gently, her bones feeling like they had just been liquefied in the river. Her dress, to her dismay, was beyond ruin now. She would have to find some large leaves or something suitable for a replacement set. "Ugh, I don't feel so good," the dragon mumbled, his chest heaving slightly as he tried to regain some of his strength. "Here, let me take a look," the princess said, reaching up and gently prying Spike's hands off his face. Ow. Did it look rather unpleasant. The right side of his face was slightly swollen, and there was some definite bruising along his jawline and his eye. None of the scales were damaged, but the swelling around his eye might not go down for a few hours, rendering his normally rather sharp vision somewhat reduced. "How bad is it?" the dragon asked, his mouth hurting. "Will I get a scar?" He cracked a smile at this, showing off a few thankfully not broken teeth. Nah, not the wittiest joke, but it helped break the severity of what their situation might have been had they not escaped the roaring river. "No, I don't think so. Your scales hold up remarkably well for a dragon as young as you," Celestia said, her soft hands gently massaging his face. "Normally, a younger dragon is a little less impervious to harm. They are, but enough about your dragon biology. Does this feel better?" The heat of her body skyrocketed as she touched him, the smoothness of his scales surprisingly soft to her touch. Who would have thought the nigh impenetrable material could instill in one feeling of softness? "Yeah, it does," Spike groaned, his body aching as Celestia's hands gently rubbed his bruised face. "It feels so good." "And this?" Celestia asked as she gently rubbed the bruised side of Spike's jaws, her fingers gently kneading the fine scales and muscles lying underneath it. She could feel something shift slightly under the light pressure she applied, as if something had become dislodged when Spike had slammed into one of the boulders. "So much better," the dragon said, whimpering slightly as his jaw popped back fully into place. It hadn't popped completely out of its socket, but it had brushed a small bundle of nerves upon going back in, hence the pain. He likely wouldn't even be able to chew for a few hours, and then only soft foods. Oh, the food. In his addled state, Spike could barely remember if Celestia's makeshift bag still had the berries and leaves in from the thorn walls. He tried to glance over, but either it had washed away with the river or was off somewhere in the grass. If it was behind her, he could not tell, as her body was large dripping wings were in the way. "And now?" Celestia asked, as her hands gently moved down and around his eye, gingerly moving his scales and underlying flesh with utmost care. The gentle actions erased the thoughts of what had happened to the food from the dragon's mind. "So good." Spike groaned once more, turning his face towards her slightly. Her pelt was matted down with water, her eyes looked like they were slight bags under them, and her dress looked even more shabby than before. Spike didn't think of that. He thought she looked like an angel, a heavenly figure sent to attend his heroically received wounds. "And this?" Celestia whispered, as she felt compelled to touch him with something softer than her fingers. Her graceful lips, puckered and redder than the most purebred rose, gently brushed against his bruised face, up and down all over his injuries. "Yeah," Spike sighed, his grin faltering as he slowly began to lose consciousness, many of his thoughts falling into nothingness as his brain demanded the rest of his weary body. His head turned a bit more as the princess's lips brushed near the corner of his mouth, and for the briefest second, and the longest of eternities, their lips met. Celestia's eyes widened in surprise, but she did not pull away immediately, as she felt as though Spike's lips and her own were suddenly glued together. Spike's lips were softer than anything she had ever experienced. and as his eyes closed, he could see within the gaze a small sense of confusion and happiness. Gently pulling away, after what could have been mere seconds or wondrous hours, Celestia looked around the clearing in the forest. A small cave, carved into the rock by seasonal flooding from the river, looked like a rather fine place to rest. It was partly concealed by large ferns and some hanging vines, but it was clear nothing was residing in it. She had, after all, overseen the transportation of each and every plant and animal on this island. Off in the distance, a loud rumble sounded again. Another storm was brewing, and they needed shelter that instant, or face the possibility of becoming even more waterlogged. "Come on, Spike," she tried Princess Aid, somehow managing to find the strength to not only stand up, but to start dragging the unconscious dragon with her. His tail spine left furrows in the ground as she hauled him away, her hand looking to hook together around his chest as she supported him under his armpits and his arms. "Let's get in the cave. We can continue tomorrow." Far away, the thunder rumbled again, and the winds began to pick up slightly. The trees over the river started to sway to and fro with the winds, and soon enough the sound of the river itself was drowned out by the approaching storm. Perhaps a little late for it to make a difference, Celestia realized the bag of food was still slung around her back. However, when she took it off, she saw all the berries, and all but 3 in the leaves, had washed away. Nearly the entirety of the Thornwall harvest was gone, and she was far too tired to try and go out looking for more. It was not even evening yet, but with the storm nearly upon them, it would be safer for her to go looking for more in the morning. Celestia popped Spike up on a large bed of comfortable, completely harmless mushrooms, the mat glowing so thick she might have mistaken it for a mattress. Lying down beside him while propping herself up, Celestia looked out in time to see the light mist beginning to fall past the cave's entrance. The rain was already starting to fall, a sharp flash of light off in the distance, distilled through the curtain of leaves, showered. The storm had arrived in full strength. "Sleep well, Spike," Celestia said, gently caressing the bruised side of his face once more. Leaning down, she captured his lips in another kiss, the feeling in her body jumping for joy at the feeling of contact. A tingle spread through her body as she did this, but sadly it went away as she withdrew her soft lips from this. Lying next to him, and lying her still somewhat wet wings over him, Celestia closed her eyes and fell asleep. Her body was exhausted from yet another near-death scenario. However, her mind was tinged with great happiness, as now not only had she accomplished something she had never done before, but she had helped save Spike's life by holding onto that rock. Had she not, they both likely would have been swept away. The tingling of the kiss on her lips left a small smile on her face as she slept. The warm air of the jungle in the cave would be far more comforting to them that night than the sound of ocean waves upon the sand. Author's note: I know that many of you are saying to yourselves, "Finally, both an update and some interaction." Well, don't worry. As this story progresses, things will get a little more intimate, and eventually, who knows? Oh wait, I do. Insert troll face. Hope you guys have enjoyed. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy this 43-minute reading. Peace off.